Hey everyone, welcome back to the Majesty of Reason. I'm Joe Schmid, and today we're joined by two returning guests, Dr. Josh Rasmussen and Dr. Amy Karofsky, to discuss necessitarianism and contingentarianism, or more simply, whether or not there's any contingency in reality. Maybe you can just give a brief glimpse into who you are and what you do, starting with Josh, and then we'll move to Amy.
My name is Josh. I'm a philosopher. And who am I? Well, I mean, that's one of my questions. I'm still working on that, Joe. But, I like to try to understand the foundations of things. So kind of my area of interest has been kind of like the fundamental nature of things or analytic metaphysics.
And I'm Amy Karofsky. I'm a professor at Hofstra. I started off in the history of philosophies, and so ended up doing a lot of work on medieval and modern philosophers, but also looking at the universe and what they had to say about it. And the more I thought about their views, especially the view that there is a necessary being that is the ultimate foundation for the universe, I came to discover that Spinoza was probably right, that there can't be any contingency. And then as I started looking at the universe in the absence of a God, I came to the same conclusion. So that's really what I've been working on.
Yeah, and by the way, people, I put links to their work and websites in the description. I've also put a link to Amy's recent book, A Case for Necessitarianism, published with Routledge, as well as a link to the discussions I had with Amy several months back, covering the contents of that book. So yeah, there'll be lots of cool things to check out in the description. So yeah, go down there, everyone. Okay, so here's an outline for today. First, we're going to be defining terms and talking about what's at stake in this debate. Secondly, we're going to just be looking at Amy's motivations for necessitarianism or against contingentarianism. And then finally, we are going to look at Josh's motivations for contingentarianism and or against necessitarianism. But before we do that, we need to define some important terms. So necessitarianism, roughly speaking, is the view that absolutely everything is necessary. There is nothing in reality that could have been otherwise in any way. Whatever is true could not have failed to be true, and nothing could be otherwise. Perhaps more simply, the actual way that reality is the only way that reality could be. So nothing is contingent in the sense that nothing could have been otherwise. So that's necessitarianism. Contingentarianism is basically just the denial of necessitarianism. It says that there's at least some contingency in reality. At least something about reality could have been otherwise in some way. And so not everything is necessary. In other words, there are ways that reality could be that are alternative to the way that reality in fact is. So in slogan form, people, everyone loves their slogans, right? So slogan form, like whereas necessitarianism is the view that everything is necessary or nothing is contingent, contingentarianism is the view that not everything is necessary or something is contingent. Okay, so that's how I understand these things. If you guys want to add anything, I guess I'll turn it over to Amy if she wants to clarify or add anything first, but then we'll turn it over to Josh to see if he wants to add what's at stake here.
Yeah. I think the only thing I'd add is this, that in some sense, now that I've completed the book and my case for necessitarianism, most of which I had to do, most of the arguments had to use contingentarian language because that's what all philosophers use. In some sense, I feel like I can kind of throw that ladder away. And that would mean that necessitarianism, even given its name, isn't necessarily the theory that everything is necessary, but perhaps even just the very straightforward claim that everything just is as it is, period. So I might just add that, but you'll hear me talking and using the terms necessary and possibility, but sometimes I will back off and say, no, actually, I don't need to engage in that discussion because it's presupposing contingentarianism or something along those lines.
That's a beautiful clarification. In fact, I was thinking kind of two-thirds through your book that kind of sort of isness, everything is what it is and is not what it is not, kind of a thing. It's kind of like the seed, I think, that gives rise. That was kind of my feeling. It's like the seed that gives rise to kind of your vision, your arguments, your intuitions. And I also wanted just to say that I really loved this book, The Case for Necessitarianism. Did I say that right?
So-
Necessitarianism. But I love the book because I felt like it's like you're not just letting, so my favorite kind of work is work that is trying to get to insight about something where you have crowds of people that are kind of missing that insight. And I feel like that's what your project was about. It was like, there's something here and there are crowds of people. And I kind of got the sense, even kind of from the beginning of the book, that you've presented versions of this at conferences and maybe you got some pushback where it almost felt like people were defending like an orthodox view or a status view, and they're not joining you on the exploration to really appreciate what it is that you're seeing. And so I really love that, and it was just exciting to read the book. So I wanted just to emphasize that. And even in our conversation today, I kind of see it as an exploration of these concepts, and so I'm looking forward to doing that with you.
Yeah, that's great. That's really well put. I appreciate that. That is a nice way of putting it. I hadn't thought about it in that way, but that you're capturing it just right.
And then as far as what's at stake, and Amy, you can elaborate kind of what's at stake kind of for you. But I was thinking of two, maybe three different things that kind of got me excited about this project. So first, everything is at stake because the thesis that everything's necessary is something about everything. You're saying of everything. It is what it is. It couldn't not have been. So everything's at stake, first of all. Second of all, if your thesis is correct, then a thesis that I've argued for, that there is something that has necessary existence, is also correct, right? Because my thesis follows from your thesis. So that's great. But then a third thing would be that there's something else that I've argued for that would be incorrect, which is that there's an important kind of distinction between maybe a foundational reality that has necessary existence and other kinds of realities that don't. And then that might have ramifications in terms of kind of our powers in the world to make differences that aren't just necessary. Like, so there's maybe alternatives. And so it'll be interesting to think about that with you and explore that. But those would be three things I think are at stake. It's like everything's at stake. Your thesis implies a thesis that I've argued for, so that's good. But also implies something that I've tended to doubt. So I'm curious to explore that with you.
Hmm. That's interesting. Yeah, and you're right. There is a sense in which everything is at stake. I think one of the things that you touched upon that's definitely at stake is the fact that it almost feels like philosophers have an echo chamber. We learn from philosophers, and then we teach each other, and we teach our students. And I become concerned that perhaps one of the echoes in that chamber concerns contingency and the belief that things could have been otherwise. There was a book symposium for this book at Hofstra in the spring, and one of the commentators mentioned that at the beginning of her semester, she always implores her students to just consider the views, at least consider the views that they don't hold or that they tend to reject. And she found herself not abiding by her own, request. She was finding that she was actually had never even considered the possibility that necessitarianism could be true. So I think that's partly at stake is just philosophy in general, the way that we teach each other and the way that we seem to just presuppose that if a theory collapses into necessitarianism, it must be false. But I think there are some really practical problems as well. I mean, certainly necessitarianism would impact our discussions about free will, and which becomes very important when we consider, say, the criminal justice system. We are going to treat people differently if we think that they, depending on how we define responsibility, which we may or may not want to get into at some point, but we may treat them differently if we think that they don't choose freely to, say, murder another person, but that we can look back at their traumatic childhood and their, I don't know, perhaps inability to reason in a way that would help them to see that that would be a bad thing, and to take that into account and then help that person rather than lock them in a cage. I think those two are probably for me the two major ways I can see that what's at stake. Yeah.
I like it. That's
Awesome.
helpful.
Awesome. Awesome. So now we're sort of getting into the portion of the discussion where we're looking at some of Amy's motivations for necessitarianism or equivalently against contingentarianism. So I guess I'll turn it over to Amy if you want to start with one prominent motivation and then we can kind of camp on it. And then I do kind of want to get to the grounding argument eventually that you develop because I found that one just personally the most interesting and fruitful. So if we can eventually get to that, I'd like to, but I'll just turn over to you to start with whatever you kind of want to start motivating necessitarianism, and then we'll just kind of camp out on it. And Josh, I mean, this is where we'll kind of get a free flowing discussion.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So that's a great question. And I think actually I can get us into that grounding argument right away because I mentioned in the beginning that part of the my journey towards necessitarianism, I wasn't always a necessitarian. So like most philosophers, I believe that things could be otherwise. But as I was studying the medieval and modern philosophers and their accounts of God and God's relationship to the universe and the universe itself, it became very clear to me, and it's part of my work in my master's and dissertation, showing that there is no way for a universe that's ultimately grounded in or rooted in a necessary being. There would be no way for there to be any contingency from that. We can see it, using God as the ultimate basis. And as Spinoza and others, even Leibniz and others have found, God as an all-knowing being would know how the universe was going to unfold. Perhaps God as an all-good being would have to choose this as the only universe that could be. And so there are many ways in which even the contingentarian theists were finding themselves committed to necessitarianism, and some didn't mind. I think Augustine was very much okay with the idea that God is a necessary being, and so is the universe. Then, but as we moved into later medieval philosophers, we start to see the need to maintain that God, not only God has free will, but also humans. And it really started to become an issue about free will and whether we could then do free will in the sense of doing otherwise. Though it is interesting that account of free will doesn't really get going until we get to, kind of the 1900s, perhaps even the existentialists Sartre and Camus. But there's another aspect, and that was that I was an adjunct instructor as when I was in graduate school, and in the very first class that I taught was Introduction to Philosophy, and one of the very first classes, I was trying to make the case for libertarianism, for libertarian free will, and it was something I thought I had, and I thought I could explain, and I was finding that I could not make a compelling argument for it. And my first reaction was, "Oh, I'll never be a philosophy professor." But then my next thought was, well, wait, maybe this thing that I always thought I had, that my professors are, seem to be teaching me that I have free will. Maybe there just is no such thing as it. And so I think I can kind of look back at my own history in my own work and writing and thinking and see that was the beginning of my, at least, consideration of necessitarianism. And then as I started thinking more about it, it just made more sense of the world and more sense of myself. And then I began to really adopt it. And then I started living it, and I was okay. Things didn't just explode. And so I can now say that I am very much alive and living well as a necessitarian.
That's great. I was kind of curious what you thought about the compatibilist notion of freedom, where you combine obviously the necessary. That word's just too hard for me though.
Terrible.
Necessary and the power to choose.
Yeah. And I do think that there is a way to make compatibilism compatible with necessitarianism. I tend to have the view that the compatibilist account is merely changing the definition of free will in order to maintain and salvage some account of free will. But I tend to think that we when we really get into the deep roots of compatibilism, we're going to end up in a mere terminological dispute. And the real question that we're all wondering is, can the future unfold in a different way? And I would say no. The compatibilist would too. And I think on that we would agree.
That makes sense. Yeah. Cool. Yeah. So you have this argument from grounding. And did you want to elaborate on that particular argument?
Yeah, so moving from that argument that I discovered in the theistic philosophers, that from a necessary foundation, only necessity follows, or things can't be otherwise if the ultimate basis of the universe is as it is and couldn't have been otherwise. And that was really the motivation for the grounding argument as well. If whether the absolute basis or foundation is God or some other necessary being, or perhaps a necessary principle, it does seem that there would have to be something that is such as it is and couldn't have been otherwise as the foundation. And if that's the case, then whatever is rooted in it, whatever is grounded in it, or whatever is rendered from it, is then also such that it could not have been otherwise. And that's the basic kind of underlying argument of that grounding argument.
Yeah. So just for the audience, I basically take it that the idea is that there needs to be some explanation for the contingency of things. So we're kind of ruling out kind of bruteness there. But the explanation for the contingency of things, you can't just solely appeal to contingent things. And so you would have to appeal to something that's necessary. But the idea is if you're appealing to something necessary to explain the contingency of things, that doesn't make much sense, because whatever is rooted in or grounded in something that's necessary is itself necessary. And so you kind of collapse the idea that there's even contingency to begin with. So does that roughly get the argument?
Yeah, that's exactly it. That's exactly it. And, so part of what I do in the book is to show that you can't have an infinite series of contingencies. You can't have a contingency that is itself basic, fundamental, because it would need some further explanation for why it is possibly otherwise. I might put it that way. And that,
yeah.
And because it would need that further explanation to explain its possible otherwiseness, it itself cannot be basic. So the only thing that could be basic is something that is such that it couldn't be otherwise.
Yeah.
This part of the book, that argument, I was kind of smiling in a way, because you were tracing a lot of the lines that I've developed in my own work for a kind of necessary foundation from explaining contingent things. And so I thought, well, that seems pretty reasonable. I mean, this pathway that those contingent things won't explain themselves if they're there, right? Of course, ultimately, your argument is going to be that they're not even there, because the necessary is not going to be able to give rise to the contingent. It, by its nature, is going to render more of the more of the same, basically. So all will be necessary. But the argument for something being necessary, I thought, that's great. Totally with you on that. And even there, I thought it might be helpful to distinguish. It was like two kinds of arguments. So one kind of argument has to do with explaining the existence of contingent things, one or many. So no matter how many there are, even infinitely many, the explanation, if it's not going to be circular, is going to, in some sense, transcend that which is being explained. And there's different ways to unpack that idea. And so that will point to something necessary. The other kind of argument is, it's not that the existence of contingent things has an explanation. I mean, that's true, but it's also that contingency itself has some like ground or basis. Like, what is it to be contingent? And I have in my notes a few different arguments that I think are kind of coming down to the same question for your position, which has to do with like grounding the very nature of contingency. Like, what makes contingency different from necessity ultimately? And then you work through some different proposals and show why those proposals fail for various reasons. And so I kind of thought that was kind of in my notes maybe your strongest argument for the view, that there's this deep question about how we can ground or explain not just the existence of contingent things, but contingency itself. What makes it different from necessity? So I have some thoughts about that, but I want to kind of highlight that as sort of a distinct argument. And then I guess there's maybe another argument, as I'm hearing you talk, which I didn't have this one in my notes, which is maybe more theologically motivated. So it's not only theologically motivated, doesn't really depend on the fundamental reality being God, but some of it is like, if you say that its nature is purely perfect or great, then it's only going to produce the greatest reality, right? So there's only one sort of way to go. That would be a kind of theological motivation. But even if it's just like some kind of like energy or some kind of stuff, and who knows what its nature is, the fact that it has a necessary nature kind of determines that there's only going to be one outcome that flows from it. And maybe that's also another kind of argument that you could even give that argument maybe independent of the grounding argument. What do you think? Am I capturing the ideas here clearly?
Absolutely. Absolutely. Yep. Yep. You're
Yeah.
spot.
Okay. So, and then I have some thoughts in my notes about that grounding argument, but I want to just kind of acknowledge that I think one of the challenges of your project is that before we get to arguments for everything being necessary, I think a lot of philosophers coming in are thinking, well, there can't be good arguments for a view that I already think is absurd, right? That's like the worry I think that you've experienced, right? And so I think one of the great things about your book is that you look at, okay, well, what are the reasons to think that this view is absurd? Like, tell me more about that. And a lot of your book is kind of rolling away those reasons, like examining them, and then rolling them away. And that all by itself, I think, would kind of open the door to that curiosity, because I feel like it's almost like your bigger project, even beyond arguing for this position, is to argue for the virtue of being like curious and open to this other way of thinking. And so even if the arguments for it maybe can be responded to, I think there's still the value of rolling away the arguments against it. So we'll get to those. I don't want to get ahead of myself, but just kind of framing that. And then if I could just kind of focus in on the grounding argument. I mean, as far as the theological motivations, maybe I don't want to travel there too much, just because maybe ultimately whatever I say there, I could say, well, maybe there are many different sort of optimal ways reality could be. There's no sort of single best. And so that leaves open a kind of indeterminacy. Then you can come back to that and say, well, but that still doesn't answer the deeper problem, which is how do you go from this necessary foundation to something contingent? And so I want to kind of focus in on I think that deeper problem, which is I think the root. And so I kind of have in my notes some strategies for how you might ground contingency. Yeah. Of course, one kind of response, and before I go into my proposals, see what you say about it, one kind of response is to say, well, I mean, there is no grounds of being contingent. That's one of those basic things. It's like not everything has a further analysis. Maybe contingency is one of those things. Or if we're going to analyze contingency, we'll analyze it in terms of its distinction from necessity. So it's contingent if it's not necessary. And then being necessary, that's the basic and unanalyzable thing. I can kind of anticipate what you'll say about that, but I want to just hear what you think about just this response, that there just is no analysis or further grounding of contingency itself. There's a ground of contingent things by the causal power of the necessary foundation, but there's not a ground, there's nothing that makes something contingent versus necessary. Those are just basic properties.
Yeah, that's interesting. I mean, my initial reaction, I feel, is that I want to say is, yeah, there's no grounding for contingency. That's just further reason for not believing it.
Yeah, fair. Absolutely.
But
yeah.
Of course, you might then say the same thing with respect to necessity. And this might be one of those places where I want to say, yeah, let's just for a second move away from those modal terms, because in many ways that's part of what I'm wanting to do, is to throw away that ladder. And what are we talking about then? Well, we're talking about just the way that things are, the way that they actually are, the way that they really are, the way that they really exist, what is in fact the case, and that then would align with what contingentarians call necessity. But then there's this other type of or way of being, which is to be such as it is, and also such that it could have been otherwise. And whereas the first account, all contingentarians can accept, because all contingentarians do accept that there is a world, there just might be more of them, or there is a way things are, they just might be possibly otherwise. So we agree with respect to the fact that there is something that is real, there is something that is actual. And in that sense, I feel like that's the way in which what we call necessary doesn't really require any further explanation. It is what it is. The reason why contingency can't be basic in that same sense is because it is not only such as it is, there's that additional element to it. It is also such that it could have been otherwise.
Mm-hmm.
And if the claim is that that doesn't need further explanation, I'd have to put that, it just seems to me that if it doesn't, there's a difference between doesn't have an explanation, which would be, I think, very damaging to the contingentarian position. And then I suppose there's another question about whether it needs further explanation. And
Mm-hmm.
that's part of what I do in the book, is to say, yeah, it just seems to me like it does need further explanation, because if it's such that it is as it is, again, that feels to me like it could be basic. It could be such that it doesn't need further explanation. It might have further explanation, but it doesn't need it. And that when you add that extra element to something, or extra feature, I'm not willing to concede that, yeah, that could have been otherwise, is just as basic. I'm not exactly sure. I don't mean to appeal to intuition, but it just seems to me that I would want to put that case to you. In
Yeah.
what sense could that be basic, in the way that we're agreeing that there's something basic, fundamental in the universe that's necessary? What would it mean then to say that contingency is like that? Well, would it mean that it's necessary? So
Mhm.
that might be one of my confusions. Go ahead. Sorry.
I was just going to say, I completely appreciate that and resonate with that. In fact, I mean, I've often made the argument that you should explain things as far as you can. And you don't have to just appeal to intuition. I mean, you can appeal to the track record of there being explanations. And this doesn't have to be like a knockdown argument. It can just be like, hey, if you're saying this is just brute, but I have a theory on which I don't have that bruteness, that unexplained feature of reality, then my theory has a certain kind of theoretical advantage. And I completely agree with that.
Yeah.
Uh, so, I mean, I might like to try to, one idea would be to try to analyze contingency, maybe in terms of its relationship to necessity. But I have some other proposals I want to explore with you. But something else I like what you're saying is that you actually have an analysis of being necessary in terms of what is. So that's where you can now throw away the ladder. Like, once you understand necessity in terms of what is, and we know that there are things that are, then we can just explain everything else.
Yeah.
And I think that I have this almost, I don't know if this is like a duck rabbit experience, where I don't know if what I want to do at this point is like try to argue against your view, or if I want to say, okay, let's play with your view and see if there's a way of still uncovering a distinction between things that are necessary and things that maybe we wouldn't call necessary. And it's a further question whether now this is a terminological dispute, like in the case of free will. Um, if what I'm going to be talking about now really is contingency, or if I'm going to be talking about something that you wouldn't call contingency, but it's going to be built out of concepts that you do recognize. So I had a few ideas for this, and maybe this is what will be the pathway. Like, let's just grant that there's an isness, and that this isness to reality is a deep explanation of really what it is to be necessary, in the way that philosophers are talking about necessary, and the way philosophers are talking about could be otherwise. That doesn't really correspond to anything. Well, let me just let me take this path of just granting that. But then it seems like an ordinary discourse, and you talk about this kind of your own practical life, you're alive and well, you're still able to have ordinary discourse. And it seems like there's still some way in which we can make a distinction between the possibility of a flower growing out of the number 4 and a flower growing out of some soil. Like, you might think a flower growing out of the number 4 seems to have a kind of impossibility to it, making it necessary that it doesn't happen, versus a flower growing out of soil, you might think, has a kind of possibility to it. And so how do you account for that? So one idea is to think in terms of, well, I kind of have two ideas. I don't know which one I want to run exactly. There's probabilities and then there's powers.
Yep.
So let's just go with powers. So because I know you have some things to say about powers. I remember seeing that. I think I remember seeing that. Causal powers. So let's say that there are things in reality that have some powers to produce a flower, and there's nothing in reality that has any power to produce a flower out of some soil versus a flower out of the number 4. Nothing in reality has a capacity to produce a flower out of the number 4. And so we can now analyze and ground contingency in terms of what powers, what capacities there are in the fabric of reality. If there are powers to produce it, it's possible. If there aren't any powers to produce it, then that will be impossible. Thoughts
Yeah.
about that?
Yeah. And so I think a lot of times when we use possible in that sense, we are using it in the sense that because we don't have all the details, or there's some information that we don't have. And that's why we can't make the absolute conclusion from this soil, a flower will bloom.
Mm-hmm.
We don't know that, only because we don't know all the factors. We don't know if it's a viable seed. We don't know if the soil is the right kind of soil, if it has enough nutrients, if it has enough water, enough light. So I think that when we use possibility in that sense, that's what we're doing. And I think that's a lot of what we have to do. We're finite beings with finite intellects. We don't always have all the factors. In fact, we rarely have all the factors to be able to make an absolute prediction that we know to be true before it unfolds. And I think that's what's happening. With respect to the flower growing out of the number 4, I would start to argue that what we need to do, and what we tend to do when we reason, is to look for contradictions. And if we have a contradiction, then we are going to be able to say, yes, that is impossible. We know that it can't happen. And what we would do is just analyze what the number 4 is, analyze what it is for a seed to blossom into a flower. And I'm guessing that we could it wouldn't be that difficult for us to render a contradiction showing that, yeah, this is an impossibility, if only the fact that the number 4 isn't physical, or something along those lines. It doesn't have energy to allow for the growth of a flower, and so we might have something like that that could render a contradiction, where they claim that, all right, we put a seed in soil, and it's possible that it will grow. The only reason why we have to use that word possible is because we just don't know all the factors.
Mm-hmm.
We're not really getting contingency there. We're just getting, acknowledgement of our of all the factors that we don't know.
Now, would you say that you couldn't render a contradiction in the case of the soil growing the flower?
I think so. All right. So now we would need like a specific case. I think it would be, we can't really render a contradiction in this kind of general way that we can with, let's say, the general concept of the number 4. I would need that soil, that seed, how you're treating it, how much light, how much water. We need all those factors in order to determine whether there is a contradiction. I mean, I think that if we put some soil out, put some light on, throw some water and throw a seed in, we would only, and the seed doesn't grow, there would clearly be a contradiction. The seed both grows, it doesn't grow. That's
right.
The type I'm thinking of. It would be that, that something went wrong here, with regard to our flower growing attempts. And would that render a contradiction? Only if we I suppose, said the flower grows, and yet it doesn't grow. I mean, we can find some contradictions, but what happens as we explore the factors and really get into the details, we'll see what did in fact happen. And that, of course, won't be contradictory or render any contradictions, because, of course, that's how things did happen. So
that makes sense. I'm so curious to explore this. This is so interesting to me. So I love how you put that, because what I hear you saying, and correct me if this is not capturing it, but that in the isness of reality, things are the way they are. And given that the way that they are, there's a next step, let's say, to reality. I had an argument in here from change that maybe is irrelevant at this point, because it was going to be something like, what it is to change is for there to be a transition between what is and what isn't becomes what is. And on a kind of dynamic theory of time, maybe this makes sense, that there's a kind of unfolding of new things coming into what is. Those things were not, and now they are. And even if they're determined, because this is an important point, like even if reality could only lead to the flower, given what it was, before the flower's there, it's not there. And so you could still say it's a contingent, in the sense that it's not necessarily included within reality, versus like an eternal thing might have stronger chance of being necessary, because it's always included within reality. So I was kind of thinking about that, but my sense is, and actually I'm curious to hear if this is right, that you can just respond that, well, no, there is no transition from what isn't to what is. Maybe this dynamic theory of time isn't right, or there's another way of analyzing that. It's just there is, and once there is, there's whatever will follow. Is that the idea? And it just follows by its natures.
Yeah, yeah. So I tend to endorse the monism that Parmenides and Della Rocca has done such a great job of articulating that Parmenidean monism. So there's that too. It's not like something changes into something else, but I do think that, you know, I'm perfectly happy talking about energy, but what energy does is continually transform. I mean, you know, we know that if it's at rest, it's nothing. You know, it's not something. And so reality energy is a continual changing, you know, evolving and moving entity itself. I mean, you know, the entire universe, everything. And so you're right. There's a sense in which it's really not what is moving into what is not, or what is not coming from what is, unless, you know, we could say what is not yet, or something along those lines. I mean, we could change it. We could timestamp it. At this moment, this is how things are. And now at,
Yeah.
you know, some later moment, this is how they will be, even though they aren't yet. Um, and whether that's just a matter of our perspective is another interesting question.
Mhm.
I've been working with the film Arrival in one of my classes, and I don't know if you've seen it, but you know, as the protagonist learns the alien language, she's able to see the future in the way that the heptapods do. And it's somewhat similar to the work that I did with some of the theistic philosophers, like, you know, some of them claiming that God sees all things all at once. So there's that, you know, there's that monistic response as well, that it is and is not is just our, again, finite human perspective of how things unfold.
Yeah. Well, what if we analyze this in terms of change? So let's say the energy itself, the sort of fundamental substance, is intrinsically, let's say, unchanging by its nature. It's necessary and unchanging, but there are forms that change. And maybe we just say that these forms are contingent. Just by definition, we just stipulate because they're changeable.
Yeah.
And then the foundational reality is unchangeable intrinsically. So we could say that it's not contingent in that sense.
Right, but not in that contingent in the sense of things being otherwise. And it is absolutely the case that contingent, that term contingency, has been used in many different ways throughout the history of philosophy. And initially it was used in particular as a way of saying that it's dependent on something else.
Right, right.
And that type of contingency is dependency is fine. My main beef is the contingency, in the sense that it could have been otherwise.
Yeah. Yeah, it could have been otherwise is tricky for me, because maybe even that concept, the words that I'm using pick out different concepts based on who's interpreting my words. And I'm wondering, so I want to explore one more analysis, and this is kind of maybe my favorite one, and the one that I'm like the most curious to think about with you, where we analyze contingency, or the way things you know, could be otherwise, in terms of logical consistency. So this goes back to the idea of deriving a contradiction. And let me kind of just draw this out a bit. It's not that if there's a flower, then we can say, well, now there's a contradiction for there to be that flower and not be a flower. But rather that just purely using truths of reason, or as we like to say, a priori principles that we can sort of see by the light of reason, by rational insight, we can take some concepts and derive either that it is or that it isn't.
Mm-hmm.
And so maybe we could kind of rediscover a distinction between the necessary energy and the contingent forms or the contingent portions of reality, just in terms of whether its absence is logically consistent a priori. Oh, because then the thought is that a priori, once I have the concept of a number, the concept of a flower, I can see without digging into the soils of reality, make any empirical observations. I can see, like you said, that there's a contradiction there. You can derive a contradiction. Whereas when I have the concept of soil and the concept of a flower, any flower, we can get very specific. We can get very specific. We say it's this flower in this soil. I can't just see by rational insight, by a priori intuitions, that those couldn't go together. And so maybe there's still an isness, so there's only one way it will go according to the isness idea. So we'll just grant that. But it's a logical consistency. It's logically consistent that the flower grows or that it doesn't grow. And that's still a very important concept. And maybe that's one way we could kind of recover that distinction, which is relevant to my own work because ultimately, kind of my cards on the table, this is, Joe knows this. I follow those philosophers who say that the strongest notion of necessity, metaphysical necessity, ends up being equivalent. Now, I wouldn't say semantically equivalent, but just equivalent, if and only if, to this kind of logical necessity, that all the necessary principles are at least in principle gleaned a priori, and then the ones that aren't necessary are not. And I'm happy to use different language if we don't want to say necessary or contingent, but just that there is this kind of two category view of reality where you have the foundational reality that has a kind of nature whose non-instantiation could actually entail, actually does entail a contradiction. And this is seeable by principles of reason. Even if we don't see it ourselves, it's the kind of thing that could be seen. Whereas then everything else that exists is in the realm of well, I should say everything else. There are other things that are contingent in the sense that there's no way to derive a contradiction from their absence.
Yeah. I feel I have this sense that that's bringing us back into the realm of epistemology rather than metaphysics. I still feel like that's just a flaw with respect to us. We just can't. We don't have enough information about it, that we're not seeing the contradiction. It seems very clear to me that if something is in fact the case, it's not contradictory. It can't be contradictory. But it also seems really clear to me that if something is not the case, there is in some sense an absence of reason and absence of explanation for it. If there was reason and explanation for its being, it would be. So I wonder if so I want to go. I'm sorry. I want to go.
I hear you. Yeah.
Two routes. If we're not seeing a contradiction, that doesn't necessarily mean that it's non-contradictory. It may just mean we haven't found the contradiction. I ask my students to try to find the contradiction in a tooth fairy. We tend to believe that the tooth fairy doesn't exist, but trying to show the contradiction is actually really difficult. But in that case, the burden of proof seems to go back on the person who claims that there is a tooth fairy. You've got to tell me and give me a complete account and complete description of the concept of a tooth fairy, of what the tooth fairy is, so that I can then analyze that concept to see if there is a contradiction. But again, if I don't find a contradiction, that doesn't mean that it's not contradictory. It may just be that I haven't searched hard enough. I haven't found it yet, or there's still some information missing that I'm not including in my analysis. So I still tend to feel like I'm wanting to go to that route to say, yeah, if you're thinking that there could be something that is possible even and involves a contradiction, I feel like we're moving off in the wrong direction with according to reason. But if we can find the contradiction, we can clearly rule it out as impossible. I'm not sure if I'm addressing your point in exactly the way that you were hoping.
But no, you are. You're getting me to. Well, you're making a point that I absolutely love. It's a point that I like to make myself, which is that um, there's a big difference between seeing how to deduce a contradiction and whether that deduction is sort of in the wings of possibility, for lack of a better word. That's really important. I kind of have this picture of like a mountain where there's these lines of entailment that go behind the mountain. They're
Yeah.
there. And just because you don't see that they're there doesn't mean that, they're not there, right? And so in mathematics, I mean, this is why there's a process of testing conjectures to see if we can prove them. And I understand, with Gödel's incompleteness theorems, people will say, well, I mean, for any finite set of axioms, there's still going to be some truths in, let's say, number theory for which there's no deduction from those finite set of axioms. That's fine. That's consistent with what you're saying, with what I'm saying, because the point is that there can be truths of reason that could be seen by insight in principle, even if they're not deducible by some other finite set of axioms. I mean, that's why there are axioms, right? There are first principles.
Yeah.
And so this suggests to me that there's really no bound to what first principles there might be in sort of the landscape of reason. And that opens up great possibilities for making deductions that are certainly outside of our view, and maybe even really couldn't be within our own view, given finite resources. So I think that does serve your point for sure. And then I'm sort of just curious, kind of, I think, building on that, whether there can be some examples. So like, take, for example, let's say a blue sphere in the sky, and then contrast that with a red sphere in the sky. Now, it seems like if I just sit in my philosopher's armchair and I'm just working from concepts, blue sphere, red sphere, forget about sky, just that's too complicated. Blue sphere, red sphere, I don't see that I can just deduce a contradiction from there's a blue sphere in the sky, or from there is no blue sphere in the sky. And if I change the color, it seems like that's not really a relevant difference. Now, it could be that I can deduce a contradiction, and the only way to know whether I can or not is to look out into the sky and then just see there's a blue sphere. So now we know that it was contradictory by pure reason that there was, instead of that blue sphere, a red sphere. But we have to be careful, because we can't include that there is a blue sphere and say, well, nothing can be both blue and, I'm getting my colors, blue and red, blue and green. Nothing can, have those incompatible colors, because it would be sort of cheating to include sort of the actual that we discovered, not a priori, not by reason, but by other means. Be cheating to include that into the thing that now we're going to derive the contradiction. It's like, the question is, can you derive a contradiction purely from reason? And maybe I have a kind of irrelevant difference intuition. Like, the difference between blue and green is not a relevant difference to whether you can deduce a contradiction. And so then that makes me think that if there was a blue sphere out there, it would be logically consistent for there to have instead been a red sphere, just in terms of what you could deduce by reason. And granting that this is kind of an epistemological point, but the epistemology I've come to think is tracking natures. So the reason that we say it's a truth of reason is because it's a truth. This is kind of my latest thinking on this, is that we have a power of conscious acquaintance with relations between natures. And so we can see that a shape of a flower and being an even number, for example, that these are sort of incompatible properties. And we can see this by acquaintance with their incompatibility. And what that feels like consciously or phenomenologically is something that we've learned to label with a priori. So the word a priori is just the name that we came up with to capture this experience of a conscious acquaintance with either incompatible natures or entailments between natures. So that's kind of my current working model on this. And then if that's right, then maybe we can recover a distinction between sort of the purely logical a priori necessity and what isn't purely logical a priori necessity. And then recognizing differences in color don't seem to make the difference between whether a sphere that's blue or a sphere that's red is logically necessary, deducible purely a priori.
Yeah, so
I'd
let's
love to
get
hear yeah.
no, so we'll have Amy give she'll basically get the final word on this. So but then we're going to turn to for the remainder of the discussion after Amy gives the final word, the some of Josh's motivations positively for thinking that there is contingency in the world. So I'll turn it over to you, Amy, but then after you kind of give that, Josh, will have you lay out some of your motivations for contingentarianism slash against
Joe, I hate to
necessitarianism.
interrupt you here, but I mean, in a way, this is it. I mean, I'm kind of
Okay.
interacting with her arguments for her view by giving kind of my motivations for contingency, just in terms of clarifying these concepts. I mean, that's ultimately it. So she can have the final word on this. I may have nothing else to offer, right? Because this is the thing that I
Oh,
was
okay. Well, then we can.
excited to explore about. Yeah.
That's good to hear then. Then actually, you guys can go back and forth on this for a little bit, probably for the remainder of the discussion if you want to. That would be fine. I thought you'd bring up something like, intuition, like it really seems like there's contingency. I thought you'd go that route. I predicted it, but maybe my prediction is not going to come to
Well,
fruition.
this is where that seeming intuition is kind of what I'm calling the sort of a priori, which I'm saying is the conscious acquaintance with these natures. And so I'm in a way giving a metaphysical explanation of the seeming. So I'm not going to rest my case on just seeming.
Sounds good. Okay, turn it over to Amy.
So good. So um this might seem unfair, but part of what I want to have to do here is to say, well, we're talking about these spheres in the sky, or not in the sky, and what color they are, but there aren't any there. I mean, what I need is to. I'm like looking in the background of your room right now, and I can see there's something gold on the table that has a bunch of holes in it. Yes, and so I feel like this is what we need to work with is reality. So it's hard for me to work with something that is purely hypothetical and then say, okay, but in reality, this is how it's going. So let's work with that. What is that, by the way?
I don't know. I saw this. It looked cool.
Yeah.
And it reminded me of consciousness because I keep thinking, what could be conscious? Could this be conscious? If you make it a little bigger, could it be conscious? These are my
Great.
thoughts. But for our purposes here, this thing exists. So maybe it would be a contradiction, given that this exists, that
Yeah.
it does not exist.
I think that the other question about whether or not it could have consciousness might be, that's the type of thing that's really at stake here, right? I mean, we're right now trying to worry about whether AI could be conscious, and one of my students said, yeah, I could never unplug what we think is AI because I just don't know, and I might be killing them or something along those lines. So it really does matter about that, whatever that is, and the question about whether it's conscious. And it's that I think we would be a little bit more fruitful to work with as an example,
Mm-hmm.
because so if we were to take, say, Searle's account of consciousness, that consciousness is necessarily a biological activity, that only something made of this type of biological stuff.
Yeah.
He says specifically the brain, and with that kind of cells, that kind of structure, only that type of thing can generate consciousness in the way that only plants can engage in photosynthesis. So if we use Searle's account of consciousness, we could render a contradiction with respect to that object and say, no, that object cannot be conscious.
Mm-hmm.
And if someone says that it is, we would then use Searle's account and say, but there's a contradiction there. You're saying that it's conscious and yet doesn't have the biological basis for consciousness, and you would render a contradiction in that way. So
Yeah.
there is a sense in which what I want is that kind of example, one that we're looking at reality
Reality. Yeah.
in order to assess reality. Let's look at that real thing and say, could it be conscious right now? And it would depend a little bit on how we're defining consciousness, which is part of the difficulty. But that's what gets us moving forward in our exploration of AI consciousness.
Mm-hmm.
If by consciousness Searle is right, we only, you need this biological stuff, then no AI will ever be conscious. But that's our next question: is Searle right?
Yeah. And if he is right, is his being right deducible purely a priori?
Yeah.
Or is his being right dependent on some non a priori principles of reason?
Yeah, and I would
And yeah, go ahead.
I would have to say it's partly both. It's a priori if we're looking at just the way these concepts are going to be defined and explained. Again, consciousness as a biological activity
Okay.
rules out the possibility that that object that is non-biological could have consciousness. So there's that seems to be somewhat a priori. Then there's the kind of what requires the experience. The wait a second, let's see if we can get consciousness in a non-biological entity, or can we get artificial then material put together in a certain way that would then generate consciousness. We would then know that Searle's account of consciousness was mistaken, or we might say, nope, that's not consciousness. That if consciousness has to be biological, then it's like schmonsciousness or something, whatever. It's something other than consciousness, and yet that's still moving us forward because we're getting a better handle on what we think consciousness is. We could if we could just have that absolute, this consciousness has to be a biological activity. But that gets us quite far in our discussion about AI. We wouldn't have to worry about consciousness anymore, but we would still have this other concern. What if it really does have this self-aware and a desire to not be unplugged? And even if we're not calling that consciousness, that's still something we'd need to take into account as well. So I kind of feel like there's a sense in which it's both in that regard.
The both, I kind of hear you pointing to, again, that value of anchoring our conceptualizations to reality, right? Like there's this reality here. Now we can start talking about what's possible, what contradictions could be deduced relative to the actual reality. And I feel like that's a very important insight. And I agree with that. Something I was thinking about as you were describing sort of the reality versus the hypothetical. Well, I was kind of having this philosopher's thought that the hypothetical is an abstract part of reality. It's not real. The hypothetical is real. And if in the landscape of, let's just call this the logical landscape, this is the landscape of pure principles of logical analysis. So given the concept of Searle's, let's say, biological analysis of consciousness, that's going to entail by logic a biological relationship to consciousness because it's built into the very concept. And then if you have a concept of a kind of what it's like from the first person perspective to have to smell coffee, I guess that's just an example. And then you have that concept, and then you start thinking about, well, what does that imply? Some people have been talking about integrated information theory, and these are kind of supposed to be built on axioms or first principles of certain concepts of consciousness. And the idea is that once you have those concepts, you can look at the landscape, the hypothetical landscape. Like if that concept applies to reality, then, because of course that gets debated too, like do these concepts apply to reality? But if it does, then these other concepts also apply. And these other concepts over here cannot apply, don't apply. And so I don't know. I mean, honestly, I don't know if we have a substantive disagreement or if it's going to come down to just how we want to label things. Because it does seem to me that there is this kind of hypothetical, logical landscape of pure reason, and that we can make distinctions within it. That, by pure reason, if there's a sphere of this color, then there's not a sphere of its opposite color. But pure reason, and I guess maybe I do have this very strong intuition that pure reason doesn't discern between whether there is ever a sphere of this color versus a sphere of a different color. That I'm not going to get by a pure reason. Even granting that there are things that you can get by pure reason that I don't know about, even granting that, it seems like there's this irrelevance of color difference that, in fact, let me be a little bit bolder. Maybe this is to Joe's idea of intuition. It's like I have a very burning intuition that a mere difference in color is not going to make a difference with respect to what can be deduced purely out of reason without any reference to what's actually the case in the, let's say, concrete world. And I think that grants the idea that what is actually the case is going to anchor a certain notion of necessity. It just adds to that there's also this logical landscape with distinctions. in there, and that logical landscape is real. So
Yeah.
I feel like maybe I'm kind of reviewing things. Maybe I'm going into more detail than I need to, but I think those are kind of my final thoughts about that.
Yeah, yeah, that's interesting. And then so I would just add two things. I'm still a little let me start again. I agree with you. As soon as we start positing hypotheticals, those hypotheticals are now out there in the world, and they're part of them. But that doesn't, of course, there's a difference between, kind of talking about so-called hypotheticals and then the hypotheticals themselves, which obviously don't exist because they're merely hypothetical, which sounds kind of contradictory in and of itself. But I think we understand what we're talking about. There's one thing that we're talking about, and then there's this other thing, reality, where what we're talking about is part of that reality, even though what we're talking about itself isn't part of that reality. So there's that. But there's this other thing about the color that I keep wanting to come back to as well. I hear what you're saying, and I think it is a common feeling, that oftentimes when we're considering an object like that whatever it is that you have it in your office, that the color doesn't matter, or it's not as important perhaps, but it can matter from in different contexts. I mean, it may just be that in the context of our discussion, and your example, and you're giving the example specifically to make the point that color doesn't matter. Maybe it's not as important, but first of all, that doesn't mean that its color isn't necessary and couldn't have been otherwise. But I think it's also that in a different context, it might well be the case that the color is very much important. If we were to ask the artist, couldn't that object have been blue? I'm thinking the artist is going to say, no, it wouldn't have been that which I wanted to create to look at, in just the way that it does with those colors that I gave it, that the color was very much important. So sometimes I think we tend to think that some properties are perhaps less important, and in that sense contingent, than others. But I think that might just be a matter of perspective, bias, perhaps at sometimes prejudice, even sometimes. But in other situations or in other contexts, it may well turn out that what we thought was not very important turns out to be actually quite important. So I wonder if that might be part of it as well.
Yeah, I agree with that. I mean, you're actually getting me think now again about those theological motivations, because if the fundamental reality has some kind of artistic senses, maybe there are some colors that it's going to love more, hypothetically, just to kind of play with the idea with the artist. And I'm actually reviewing an article right now about the sort of boundaries to evils and negative states that would be necessitated by a perfectly good foundation. And then, well, this suggests that your kind of blind intuition that, well, the difference between, let's say, this state and that state is not relevant to whether you can deduce a contradiction. Well, kind of to your point that, well, maybe it is. Maybe it is for reasons that are kind of outside of our view, for aesthetic reasons or reasons that have to do with the basic structure of reality. That if we actually did have full grasp of reality, we would be able to deduce by reason a priori both the existence of that reality and everything that follows.
That's
And
it.
so that is a very fascinating proposal.
Yeah, that's it. And then I think that it has a lot to do then with a really important concept right now. So part of that, we started this discussion about motivation. I think one of the major motivations right now, given our current climate, is truth. What we want is to get at the truth, and we need to maintain that there is something that is in fact true. I've been starting to move. I've had this position, and I didn't quite know that there was a theory of truth called the identity theory of truth, which says that truth isn't a property of propositions. It's not about what we say or the words that we use. Truth just is what is in fact the case, what is actual, what is real. And I think a lot could be done if we could get back to that. That was an early account of truth. The pre-Socratics until Plato all held that that view that truth is just what is in fact the case. And then Aristotle comes along and says it's about what we say, and we kind of moved from there to the claim that, and again, that echo chamber, that truth is a property of propositions, and that's how it has to be. And I'm starting to think that that's part of our problem. And that what we need, and part of the reason why this project is so important, is because we need to get at the truth, and that we need to be able to recognize when we are caught in an echo chamber, when we're not considering the other side, when we're dismissing it outright because that's what we've always done, and the way to resolve it is to figure out which side or which position is getting at reality.
Yeah, yeah.
Full stop. Yeah.
I love that. We're actually talking about this in my classes, truth. What is truth? And you're making some of the points that I've been making with the students, which is that truth is connected to reality. Or if it is, I try to kind of be neutral about it. If truth is a connection to reality, then to get to the truth, it's not going to help to just investigate the propositions in your mind. You have to go and face reality. Like, you could be completely rational in your own mind because of your echo chamber. Like, your beliefs are completely valid in that sense, in the sense of matching your own perspective. But you're kind of in an echo chamber. You're not really seeing actual reality. And to kind of anchor this to reality, I think inspires curiosity, humility, the courage to keep updating your views. And completely with you on that, for sure.
Yeah, we sort of almost ended the discussion where we started, where there's a lot at stake, and ultimately what's at stake is what's true and what's out there in the world. So everything is at stake, as Josh, you like to say, and I think you're right. So okay, do we have any I guess closing remarks? I'd like to give my guests an opportunity to say anything that they didn't get a chance to say, or just any closing comments. And how about we start with you, Amy, because we began with Josh earlier. So.
Wow, I feel like I actually just said it, that little bit at the end. I wasn't really planning on doing that, but it's funny. I'm teaching truth right now in one of my classes as well, and it's just something that I've been. I looked up in the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy the theories of truth, and I came across that identity theory, and so that's something that that's been on my mind a lot. So I wasn't planning on talking about it, but that really was my my end statement. So that seems okay.
Yeah, and then Josh.
I love that. It does bring us full circle, because I kind of hear you describing at the end there about facing reality, anchoring your view to what is the case, the sort of the isness of reality, as being that motivation for this project. And I completely resonate with that. I have one final little thing on in my notes, which is connected to distinguishing between what's real and what isn't real. So this was something from the book. You were kind of pointing out that there are no examples of non-actual actual things. Okay, and then you have setting aside contingentarian assumptions, right, of how to analyze that. So yes, there are no examples of non-real real things, or non-actual actual things. And I was thinking in our conversation about maybe this distinction between the sort of elements within our own mind that are perhaps little maps, for lack of a better word, little maps of the reality. So maybe we could call some of these elements propositions or thoughts, or whatever we want to call them. There's a sense in which they aren't themselves the reality, although we can be careful about that, because we can have other maps about maps in our own mind. So I can say, well, I really am thinking. I really have thoughts, in my own mind. So I can have maps about other maps. But what makes the maps true is the reality. And so this was making me think that, maybe we could even kind of think about how to think of what's real in terms of whether certain maps or concepts, or I had in my notes types, like abstract types, are instantiated by something in the world. So, I mean, in some sense, we could say that the types are themselves real. Maybe they're real in my mind, but in another sense, they're not real unless they're also instantiated in the world. So we can make that distinction. And then once we make that distinction, then maybe it could be sort of an open question whether there are some types that are in your mind that whose instantiation is deducible by pure reason, or whether, that they must be instantiated just by pure reason, without observations of the world. And maybe that could be an open question, because it's going to depend on the actual nature of reality to sort of answer that question, which is one of the points that you've made. So that's it. I've made it through all my notes. This has just been so much fun, Amy. This is one of my favorite all-time conversations because, and let me tell you why. It's because I feel like with you, there's no limit to the depth together, and then your quickness to understand and to reverberate. And I don't know. I think it's kind of a rare treat to have this kind of a conversation, think about these ultimate things in this way that I feel like is collaborative and productive. So thank you.
And fun. I really find this. I know it's a kind of a geeky thing to say, but I really do find it fun. I totally agree with you. Just so much fun to be able to go back and forth, almost like, you know, a tennis game where you're just kind of hitting around and seeing where it goes and what you can do. And this was just an absolute pleasure. Just a lot of fun.
Thank you.
I guess another thing that I'll just mention is, no, I thought I was on mute. Okay, I'm not on mute. Another thing that I'll mention is a final thing that I appreciate about this is that, you know, Socrates was called, I think, what was it, like the gadfly of Athens or whatever. Like the gadflies, those little things that kind of bug you just a little bit, and you try to swat them away, but they always come back. And I kind of like that sort of metaphor for philosophy. You know, it's almost like a gadfly. You know, like these questions are a lot of people just don't challenge fundamental assumptions, underlying assumptions. They take for granted things that, you know, philosophy likes to question and likes to kind of probe. And so I kind of see this discussion about necessitarianism, and especially Amy's work, as a kind of, in a good sense, a philosophical gadfly, in that, you know, there's a kind of dogmatism in some areas of philosophy where, you know, you don't even take necessitarianism seriously, just total full-blown assumptions, unquestioned, about, you know, contingency and contingentarianism and whatnot. And so it's nice to see, like, among philosophers who are notorious for questioning foundational assumptions, philosophers within the philosophers who are questioning the assumptions of the other philosophers. So it's like a gadfly among gadflies. So anyway, I like that. I quite like that. And I think it's a good sort of metaphor to end on. So anyway, thank you guys both for coming on. I really appreciated this conversation. I hope the audience gets a ton out of it, as I did. Again, reminder, links to both of their stuff is in the description. So everyone go click show more and see all the stuff in the description. And yeah, if you see value in the work that I do, please consider becoming a patron or making a one-time donation. And as always, smash that like button, turn on that little bell for notifications. And of course, yes, smash it. Exactly. You heard it from Josh himself. So, and as always, I always do, what better way to end is there than I'm Joe Schmid. This is The Majesty of Reason, and peace out.